Hello out there, and welcome to Big News About Little Kids, live from 0 to 3's 28th National Training Institute here in San Antonio, Texas. I'm Amanda Perez, a child development specialist at 0 to 3, and I am honored to moderate this exclusive virtual press briefing hosted by 0 to 3 in the Journalism Center on Children and Families. It's an incredible time to be thinking about the youngest children and their families, as this field is really exploding with new research, new information, and new discoveries with tremendous implications really for all of us. Here in San Antonio, we are surrounded by 2,000 participants at this year's conference, here to hear cutting-edge research and innovative programs and practices here from some of the top experts in the field of early childhood development. From close to 100 sessions, we have identified 3 presenters for you all today who will talk about some really exciting findings in dual language learning, in brain development, and in autism identification and treatment. We'll hear a 10-minute presentation from each presenter, followed by a question and answer session. Please remember that during and after each presentation, you can submit your questions for reference during the Q&A. If at the end here, I promise your question is not answered, I will give you contact information for direct follow-up with the presenters. Thank you for joining us, and a very special thanks to Julie Driz Journalism Center for helping to make this briefing possible. Without further ado, now I'm going to introduce our first presenter. In a time of growing diversity in our communities, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Linda Espinosa from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who will be discussing effective supportive practices for infants and toddlers who are dual language learners. Dr. Espinosa.
Thank you, and it's an honor to be here. What I'm going to talk about is the language and literacy development of young dual language learners. What do we know and what can we do? So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about their development. What's the new science around how young dual language learners develop? And then a very brief amount of time talking about what do we as early care and education providers need to understand to provide high quality services to this unique population. So who are dual language learners, or often referred to as English language learners? The definition that we use is that dual language learners are children learning 2 or more languages at the same time, as well as those learning a second language while continuing to develop their first or home language. And this is a term that has been deliberately chosen by the federal government, by many research institutes, by the state of California, by other states as well, because it connotes the fact that these children are not just learning English, but they in fact have a dual language system. They have a first language that is not English, on top of which English is acquired. And they will always, throughout all of their school achievement, through all of their linguistic accomplishments, they will always be different and unique because they have a first language that was not English. This term can apply to any ethnicity. It's not synonymous with Latino. Oftentimes people confuse Latinos with dual language learners. Not all dual language learners are Latinos, and not all Latinos are dual language learners. And we're talking about children who both learn 2 languages from their first or earliest days of life, or what we call simultaneous, or 2 first languages, as well as children who are sequential or successive. So they have a first language, and their first systematic exposure to English usually is when they enter an early care setting. But I emphasize this also because the term applies to the characteristics, the linguistic characteristics of the children. It does not apply to the characteristics of the programs that they're in. So dual language learners can be in English immersion programs. They can be in bilingual programs. And sometimes people confuse these 2 terms. So we know that we're more diverse than we've ever been. The population is growing, and it's growing in its diversity. Our latest figures show that over 30% of all children in Head Start are dual language learners, and more than 140 different languages are spoken in Head Start. Across the United States, it's more than 400 different languages. And at this point in time, almost all Head Start centers do serve young children who are dual language learners. In my work with Head Start programs, I would say most of them serve probably at least 3, 4, or 5 different language groups. So it's not really an issue of Spanish and English anymore. We have huge proportions of children that are neither English nor Spanish speakers. The group that I most recently worked with actually were from Bosnia, and they were in a Midwestern town that had very little experience with anybody that wasn't a native monolingual English speaker. So the numbers of different languages that are represented in our communities and the proportion of children is both growing rapidly. And it's not just in the urban cities. It's actually throughout, in many states throughout rural communities as well. We've known for a long time that dual language learners are at risk for lower levels of academic achievement, and you can look at any metric. I'm sure you're all aware of the statistics around this, that it's a group of children for which there's high educational concern. If you look at kindergarten entry scores, and we're even now seeing language differences as early as 18 months and 3 years of age. If you look at our national achievement data at 4th and 8th grade, you look at state achievement data, college enrollment, college completion, employment opportunities, etc. This is a group of children on the whole, even though it's very diverse, on the whole has struggled in our academic system. So what I want to talk about just briefly is how can science research guide our policies and practices for dual language learners? What's the new information from science that should be guiding our state policies, our federal policies? And then how can all teachers support the language and literacy development of dual language learners? So the points that I want to mention are the capacity of the infant, the language learning capacity of infants and all infants. The benefits of emerging bilingualism for young children in cognitive, social, linguistic, executive function skills, and family dynamics. The charge, I think, to the early childhood profession, which is to support both languages, and the issue around working with families effectively, which is just critical to their long-term achievement. And I wanted to just mention briefly an aspect of the science that's contributing to this knowledge base that I find so fascinating. So how do we know these new things about multiple language exposure when children are in the first, or say, 18 months of life? Since children aren't talking very much at that point, and typically we used to use, motor assessments, and language assessments came into larger play as children got older during the preschool years. So on this screen, here's the way I describe it. On the left-hand side is a neuroimaging technique where they put monitors on the scalp that measure the electrical activity. So through this technique, you can find out when children are responding to what types of language stimuli. And it's been around forever and ever. Many of us in our college undergraduate courses actually experience that kind of EEG or ERP assessment. The new phenomenon, the new technology on the right is called magnetoencephalography, and what it does, and it's a very expensive machine, it's extremely expensive, and I think we have just one in the country right now at the University of Washington in the Institute for Language and Brain Sciences, but it records in non-invasive ways both when certain neural areas of the brain are activated based upon what type of stimulation over time and where in the brain this is happening, so that you can start to see cause and effect kind of relationships between this language and that language. So this very new sophisticated technology, and I think Dr. Fox will probably talk about it a little bit more, I think is giving us some insight into what's happening to young children, and I think it's somewhat revolutionary. So what it's telling us is that all infants have the innate capacity to learn more than one language. And some of the conclusions from the cognitive neuroscientists are that the human brain is actually hardwired to learn language. Okay, so that we're primed to learn language, to give it preferential attention, both as soon as the child is born, and they can even hear and respond to linguistic stimulation during the last trimester of pregnancy, when the oral perceptive abilities have developed. So during that first year of life, during those first 6 months of life, all children can perceive all phonemes, whether or not they're important in their native language. So it's kind of like they hear everything, they attend to it, they process it, they record it, and they can remember it. All of the features of all the different unique languages. For bilingual infants, what seems to be happening is that two linguistic systems are developing, so that what's happening for instance, if somebody's speaking to the child in English, oh my goodness, okay. let me go on. The important point about this is that by 10 to 12 months, before children have spoken a single word, that their perceptual ability to hear and record and produce sounds has narrowed. Before their 12th month of age, they have actually narrowed in their ability to hear sounds that are not in their language environment. So this, Patricia Cole's laboratory has developed this graph that shows the critical period for language. And because of these neurological capacities, or these sensitive periods where the brain is open to and able to process different sounds, they found that after about 7 years of age, that capacity starts to decrease dramatically. I'd like to clarify that, though, because they're really just talking about the phonology. So it doesn't mean adults can't learn a second language. What it means is that perceptual acuity has decreased. But through great study and hard work, I think adults can learn any language as well. So human fetuses are able to memorize sounds from the external world by the last trimester of pregnancy, with a particular sensitivity to melody contour in both music and language. Babies have been found to coo, babble, and cry during their first months of life in their native language. So they repeat those acoustical, lyrical qualities, whether it's German or French or English. Their babbling actually mimics those particular sound systems. So just to summarize, the timing's important. Infants have enormous capacities, and people often call them linguistic geniuses, separate linguistic systems or patterns in the brain for each language. There are social and statistical aspects to language learning, but your environment is critical. Benefits, differences between dual language learners and monolinguals. What the studies are finding in the last 5 years or so, a lot of studies have come out and actually documented what some of the cognitive benefits around emergent bilingualism for very young children. Executive function, which includes working memory, inhibitory control, suppressing interference, and mental flexibility. Across multiple studies, everybody is finding advantages in these areas, which are essential for school and academic success for balanced bilinguals, children who have relatively equal skills in both. I think probably everybody's heard about the Alzheimer's protection, and I think there are some neurological explanations for that, some social, emotional, and pro-social competencies, but there are also differences in vocabulary. So they might look like they don't have adequate vocabulary if you assess them against monolingual norms. So the implications: all children can become bilingual. Knowing 2 languages offers advantages. Starting early is best. And English acquisition is desirable, but should not come at the expense of the home language. And to do that, we have to work with our families. I love this quote: "When I was a little and really wanted something, I prayed to God in 2 languages, just in case God didn't know one of them." Knowing 2 languages opens many doors for children, ensuring that nothing is lost in the translation. And that was a child's quote. So, in conclusion, all of our early care practitioners cannot instruct in all languages, but all early care providers can support all languages by working with families and using specific strategies that bring home language and culture into care settings. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Espinosa. So good to hear about the benefits of that dual language learning for children, as we know that so many families have that opportunity to provide those kids that language. Please remember that you can submit your questions for Dr. Espinosa to answer at the end of all 3 presentations. Next, we're going to move on. We heard a little bit about sensitive periods as we learn more and more about the critical foundation the first 3 years provide to later learning and development. We welcome Dr. Nathan Fox of the University of Maryland, who is joining us to share some of the latest research on early brain development. Dr. Fox.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be talking to you about the most recent advances in the brain science, which can influence our decisions about how we think about early childhood education. So let me start first with 3 core concepts for development. The first is that brain architecture is established early in life and supports lifelong learning. It provides a foundation upon which later learning and later development occurs. The second is that stable relationships serve in return the ability for an infant to interact with a loving and responsive, warm and caring adult is important, and it actually does, in fact, shape brain architecture. And the third is that there are actually instances and situations which can produce toxic stress in early years, and those can derail healthy development in children. So let's talk about the first, which is experiences build brain architecture. We know, just like building a house, that building the brain occurs from the bottom up. And so brains are built over time, starting in the very earliest years, actually starting prenatally, and then through the postnatal years. Simple skills beget more complex skills. Early learning is the foundation for later learning. Cognitive, emotional, and social capabilities are intrinsically intertwined throughout the life course. And then a strong foundation in the early years improves the odds for positive outcomes, and a weak foundation increases the odds of difficulty. Let me illustrate this for you. If you look at the ability to change brains and for brain plasticity, what you see is that over age and over development, normal brain plasticity decreases. On the other hand, the amount of effort that it takes for someone to learn something new and to enhance neural connections gets more and more difficult as individuals get older. So it's easy for an individual to learn a language early in life. It's more difficult as they get older. It's not to say that you can't and that there isn't brain plasticity. It's just that the amount of effort that is necessary is much greater as you get older. How do we know about the development of brain plasticity and about the foundation for early brain development? Well, we can look at the development of brains in terms of what areas of the brain are developing and what skills are developing early and when. This graph illustrates that the brain pathways and areas and connections that are associated with vision, audition, and hearing, those are the ones that get wired up first. The ones that get wired up afterwards are the ones that are associated with language. And you can see that the curve is shift to the right, which means that those skills are emerging later, and the neural connections that are associated with them are getting wired up later. And then later on, higher cognitive connections, those areas that are associated more with the frontal parts of the brain, those areas are getting wired up much later during the preschool years and actually on through adolescence. But what we can see here is that there is a sensitive period in the first year of life during which visual, auditory, and sensory processes are being wired up, and the foundations for language are also being set. Now, you can see this illustratively in the following images that I'm going to show you. Here's a slice of the brain from the prefrontal area at birth, and what you can see here is that there aren't very many neurons, and those neurons aren't very interconnected. And here's a slice from that same area of the brain from a 6-year-old. And what you can see here is the multitude of neuronal connections, the multitude of neurons. So between birth and 6 years of age, there's been a proliferation of neurons and the connections, the synapses that are connecting these neurons together. By 14, this same area of the brain there are now fewer connections, and that's because there's been pruning of the neural connections between 6 years and 14 years. It's as if the scaffolding that was erected between birth and 6 years of age is taken down now that the competencies and the learning is fully established. We also know that interaction shapes brain circuitry. And here what I'm talking about is serve and return, the ability for the infant and caregivers to interact with each other in shared dialogue, in contingent social interaction. Young children naturally reach out for interaction through babbling, facial expressions, gestures, and adults respond in kind. This serve and return, this interaction that's going on between them, is essential for the development of healthy brain circuits. And the systems that support the quality of relationships in early care settings, in communities and in families, is foundational for allowing the study of sturdy brain architecture. Now, what's a good data point in order to understand this issue about verbal input and its importance early in life? This is a study, actually the study was done in 1995 by Hart and Risley, in which they tracked the emergence of verbal ability in 3 different groups of children. Children from college-educated families, working-class families, and welfare families. And what they found is that through 16 months of age, they were all the same. The infants were all the same in terms of their verbal ability. But you can see that starting at 24 months of age, the gap widens, and it continues to widen between the children of parents from well-educated families and the children from parents from not well-educated families. And Hart and Risley and other people after them have understood that what the missing ingredient here in some families is verbal interaction between the child and the parents. The final comment is about toxic stress and how it derails healthy development. There are really 3 levels of stress that we all encounter. The first is what we call positive stress, and this is brief increases in heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormone levels. Everyone experiences stress, and it's actually, scientists have found that it's actually good to experience these levels of stress. It motivates behavior and responsive behavior in approach behavior to learn about the environment. But there's a second level of stress called tolerable stress, which are serious but temporary stressors in the environment, which can be buffered by supportive relationships. So, for example, the loss of a parent can be a tolerable stress for a child if, in fact, that child is living in a community and family where there are supportive relationships. And the final level of stress is what we call toxic stress. And that's prolonged activation of stress response systems in the absence of protective relationships. Now, we know that relationships buffer stress. Learning how to cope with moderate, short-lived stress can build a healthy stress system. But toxic stress, when the body's stress system is activated excessively, can actually weaken brain architecture. We actually know, the science tells us, that without caring adults to buffer children's toxic stress associated with extreme poverty, neglect, abuse, or severe maternal depression can have long-term consequences for learning, behavior, and physical and mental health. We also know from the neuroscience that it has specific effects on the brain. So here you have illustrations of what persistent toxic stress can have on neurons. You can see actually the damage that can occur to neurons as a function of stress. So now 2 principles of brain development: experience expectant and experience dependent learning. Experience expectant is that the brain is actually waiting to receive information in order to grow. And that's what we call sensitive periods, these periods of this experience expectant brain growth. Sensitive periods are limited times during which the effective experience are particularly strong, and it allows the neural circuits to process information, and it provides information that's essential for normal development. It was first thought of as a critical period, like the imprinting that you saw with ducklings, but basically what we know is that sensitive periods exist throughout the lifespan. Now, I'm going to give you just a couple of examples of sensitive period research from my own work on the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. This is a study in which we have followed infants and young children who were in Romania and warehoused to institutions. We actually took a group of these children out of institutions and we placed them into families. We measured their brain activity, both before they were placed in the intervention and after, and here's what we found. What we found is that infants in the institution, their brain activity was actually much lower compared to infants that were growing up in the typical community. You can see the red, which is power in the brain, and the lack of that power in the children that were in the institutions. 8 years later, when we followed those children, we actually found that our intervention worked, but it only worked for those children that were taken out before the age of 2. If you were taken out after the age of 2, your brain power at age 8 was similar to those children that remained in the institution. A couple of other examples. We've studied the telomeres, which are these small caps at the end of chromosomes, and that are associated with health and aging. And what we have found is that the longer children stay in the institution, particularly girls, the shorter their telomeres and the more likely they are to experience the adverse consequences of that for long-term health and development. Finally, I wanted to just tell you about the establishment of relationships that occur in the institution and how our intervention has combated that. Suffice it to say, living in the institution is not amenable to establishing a healthy, secure relationship, but it is, in fact, we do find that our intervention is successful in ameliorating and remediating these attachment problems. And again, it's when you're being taken out. So before age 24 months, you're successful. After 24 months, you're not. So in closing, there are no magic bullets. Positive relationships and quality learning experiences can be promoted through evidence-based parent education, family support, and intervention. And a balanced approach, emotional, social, and cognitive development, will prepare children for later learning. Basic health services should be provided to children, early education, targeted services for children who are experiencing toxic stress in order to provide them with the foundation for later positive learning and the development of brain architecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Such tremendous implications, I think, from that work that you described. Again, I want to remind people to remember that opportunity to submit any of those questions to Dr. Fox now. But before we turn to the Q&A, I want to introduce our third presenter, Dr. Lucy Miller of the Sensory Processing Disorder Foundation in Denver, Colorado. 1 in 88 children is diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders, and I know there's been huge public interest in that and how to best support those children and families. We're really pleased that Dr. Miller is here to share new research on detecting autism at the earliest possible moment, and a promising approach as well in working with young children and families around some of autism's common underlying sensory issues. Dr. Miller.
Thank you so much.
It's always the technology stuff that sort of stops us at this point, right?
Right. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm here to talk to you about autism and sensory processing. Now, all of us know what autism is, but what is sensory processing and what is the impact of sensory processing problems on children with autism? There's some brand new research that is so exciting that I want to go over very briefly with you today that tells us that children who have movement and sensory problems at a very young age can be identified, and then the treatment for those problems can be started at an earlier age. So I want to show you a quick little clip of a sensory processing problem in a child with autism. And it would be great if this plays. Let's try clicking on it. Okay, here we go. So here's a child who looks like a fussy baby. Can you turn that sound up just a touch? When his mother moves him, touches him, plays with him, he cries. Everything the mother or father does makes this child cry because he is so sensitive to sensation. And here is another type of sensory processing problem. In this case, the child is under-responsive to sensation. Hi. She knocks on the window. She tries to get his attention. And as you can see, he doesn't respond to her. This is his father. He's never been able to play with his son. Imagine what this father feels like.
My turn.
The problem with sensory issues is they can look like bad behavior. So here's a child who's oversensitive to sand and to touch.
It has to stay in the box. You can play with the sand, but it has to stay in the box. Okay, we're going to have to put it away. You can play with it, but it has to stay in the box.
You're stupid.
You're stupid, he says.
And you can play with it, but it has to stay in the box.
And here's Dad watching.
You're stupid.
You're mad. You can't take the sand out of the box.
You're stupid.
Oh, okay.
And how does Dad feel watching his little son? There are 3 new studies which have shown us that we can diagnose these children very early. One is an eye gaze study that was published 2 weeks ago only. The second is a head lag study that I want to show you very quickly. And the third has to do with the sensory processing scale. In the first study, there were 110 babies in 2 groups, siblings of autistic children who we consider high risk for autism, and the second was siblings of typical children who we consider low risk for autism. Now you know, if you have children, or even if you don't, that looking at your baby and having your baby look back at you is a normal way of relating to children, of loving children, of connecting with children. But what we know now from this eye gaze study is that children who do not have typical eye gaze at a very young age are at high risk for autism. In the study, the babies were positioned to watch their mother's faces and for the computer to track that. Here's a baby watching, and the computer tracks exactly what part of the mother's eyes and face the baby looks at. Here's an example of the computer tracking this information. And what we found out from this amazing study is that by 24 months, typical children focused twice as much on their eyes of their mother or father as children with autism. When they went back to track which of those children it was and at what age the children stopped looking right at the mother's eyes, as young as 2 months, we could see children who were not looking right at their mother's face, right at their eyes. As young as 2 months, we might be able to find these children and start early intervention. The second study is a head lag study, where we looked at 20 siblings of typical children and 20 siblings of autistic children and measured how much the child's head lagged behind when we lifted them up. So here it is in motion. When a child is lifted from lying on the ground to sitting up, we look at their head lag. Notice how this child's head lags behind his body. He cannot keep his head up even with his body. Here it is slow motion for you to see it again. I know you can all see this. And what's amazing about what the findings were was that the children who later had autism, 75% of them, could not lift their head up at 6 months. the head lagged behind, compared to only 33% of the children who did not have autism later. And a sensory scale, a scale that could be filled out by any parent, any teacher, and has items like discomfort with washing or wiping your face or hands, discomfort putting on shoes or socks, discomfort being held close to the parent's body. You can see the items over there. If not at all is checked, the child gets a low score of 0. If most of the time is checked, the child gets a high score here of 27. This is only a few of the items. But what we found was completely different scores for typical children and children who later had autism. The typical children have very low scores. The children with autism have very high scores. So all of these things together suggest that we are going to be able to find children at a much younger age, and that the studies which have been done looking at language acquisition and social skills acquisition, though they're important, suggest that kids cannot be identified until language develops or social skills develop. This motor and sensory research suggests that we can find these children much earlier and start intervention. This is the Star Center in Denver, where we start treatment of children very young. We use a new system, a new model, which is intensive treatment every day for 30 sessions. We have very intensive parent participation, education, and coaching with multiple disciplines, including marriage and child therapy, psychology, speech language, and so on. This is where our children come from, around the United States and internationally. And parents looking at the children through a one-way mirror will say, "But you're just playing with them." And we say, no, it's not just play, it's smart play. Sensory, motor, attuned play, relationship-rich, and time. We need to spend time with these kids. And we teach parents to do this smart play. Look at this example of a child being treated. Here he is before treatment, and you will see that every time his mother wants to play with him, she puts her hands up. She almost begs him to look at her, to play with her. And Mikey looks away. He looks away from his mother. I slowed this down so you can see how profound this is. And he's very interested in the object. He's very interested in building this tower. But he's not really interested in engaging with his mother. Please, she says, please. And is this just because of the mother? Well, let's look at what happens with his therapist. Here he is looking away from the mother.
Over here.
And here he is looking away from the therapist. So we worked with him for 4 weeks, intensely every day. And let's see if we made a difference in this child. After 4 weeks of treatment, here he is with his therapist.
Perfect. Really slow. He's looking. He's trying to draw back too now.
Have we broken through? Have we created a relationship between this child and the therapist?
You've got him slow. And now, yes.
This is a profound difference for this child. And it's not just with the therapist, that wouldn't really matter. It's with his mother as well. And we just happened to catch the first time the child and mother shared a glance. So this is an amazing thing. And what it means for us is we have hope. We have help for these children.
So my relationship with him has changed in the most brilliant and colorful way.
I hope you can
From
hear
our first
this.
visit here, we were able to understand him. So I would know when he was banging into my side what that meant. He's completely saved our family, and this has completely saved my marriage and my relationship with our boy. And now we have a beautiful, sparkling, articulate, brilliant, kind.
There is hope and help for parents, and there is hope and help for kids.
I'm strong. I don't give up. It makes me really proud. I'm the boss of my body. I'm the boss of my brain. I can do it. I can do it, Pumpkin. I am strong.
So this is our mission, to find these children young, to get them the treatment they need. And if we all work together, we can make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. It's amazing to see that profound change in those children that we were able to see. Thank you. We now have time for question and answer. We have a few questions that have come in. We welcome those questions. Dr. Espinosa has to go. She has a plenary this afternoon, so we really want to release her on time to get to that. But we want to get to one question for her first. Here's the question, Dr. Espinosa. Because of the importance of rich early language environments, by the time kids get to preschool age, is it too late to level the playing field in terms of language development?
Right. Is this mic on? Should I?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me first of all say that I think that's 3 years of age is not too late. Definitely, it's not too late. There's always an opportunity to provide a rich language environment that children will benefit from, and we do start to see some catch-up effects. I think sometimes we misinterpret that graph about the critical period for language development, and we think it can never happen. But I would agree with Dr. Fox in the sense of, there are times when it's easier because it's central to that period for its developmental tasks. And language learning and brain attentional processes are inherent in that birth to 3. It doesn't mean it can't happen later, even though we may see some gaps. I mean, that's what our whole early childhood profession is all about, is providing these enriched early language and cognitive learning opportunities for children from backgrounds where they don't necessarily receive it in the home. So absolutely, it's not too late. I mean, nobody should ever think that, because you're going to view children in very different ways and view them from a deficit point of view, and that's not going to help you envision a potentially gifted child who can become proficient in 2 languages. I mean, that's the issue. No, definitely not. So I would hope to dispel any of that. It's not too late at 5 either. It just becomes harder,
Yes, thank you so much. We hope you have a great session
thank
this
you.
afternoon. We're thrilled that you're here, and we will offer her contact information at the end if others want to talk to Dr. Espinosa. Dr. Fox, we have a question for you as well. Will you be following those children from Romania and scanning their brains for their whole lives? It's a big project.
Yeah. We have a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health, part of the NIH, to follow the children through age 16. So at least through that age, we're going to be doing our brain scanning and brain imaging. But past that, hard to tell.
Hard to say. Is that a hope?
Yeah, it's a hope.
Okay, and this is a question now for Dr. Miller. I'm curious whether Medicaid covered the cost of your treatment. How about the leading insurance companies? And if not, what would it take to get them to pay for that treatment as a part of what you're doing?
Medicaid does not cover enough to pay for the intensive treatment that the children need, although changing the model so the children are treated every day in a row for, say, 30 sessions instead of once a week for 30 weeks can make a huge difference. Many of the insurance companies do cover, about half of the insurance companies. What is needed is an advocacy effort on the part of parents and recognition in diagnostic systems that these sensory processing issues are valid, they're real, so that they can receive a code and parents can use that code to submit to their insurance company.
And if we're thinking about sort of a public information kind of piece of this, are there particular messages, Dr. Miller, that you would say these are the kinds of things that we need to know in the public? I know you covered some of those pieces, but are there 2 or 3 messages that you would suggest for that?
Sensory processing, Dr. Fox showed us the incredible importance of sensory functioning in the early years. It is a real disorder. It needs to be measured, and it needs to be treated if there is a problem, because it has implications for language, for socialization, for self-esteem, for self-regulation, and so on. So the first message is that sensory processing disorder is a real disorder. Mm-hmm. The second one is that treatment works, and we have studies now showing that. So I think the public health message needs to be to doctors, to scientists, and to those who are developing diagnostic taxonomies, that these children deserve our help early. That's what 0 to 3 is all about. Early identification and early treatment of children with these disorders.
Absolutely. So one question that came in is, does the DSM cover this? Is SPD as a part of that?
Okay, big question. 18-year effort starting in 1994. We thought we were going to make it. We had a national effort to work on this. At the last minute, they decided not to cover it, although they do cover sensory processing disorders within autism. So if you have autism, sensory processing is now one of the several criteria that you can use to get a diagnosis of autism. It's kind of strange because most of the children with sensory processing disorder do not have autism, although all the children with autism have sensory issues. So more about that on our website, which I'm sure you will be posting for people.
Yes.
And I'm happy to talk to anybody, and I love to give people tours of STAR and talk to them about these issues.
It's never a bad time to go to Denver, right? Here's a question for Dr. Fox. It says, I'm thinking about the expression that children who face abuse and neglect are forced to grow up early. Is there evidence that of that in the brain or arrested development? Are they forced to grow up early?
So I don't know that expression, but I do know that we have good evidence that the early experience of maltreatment and neglect, in particular neglect, leads to significant changes in the brain. And those changes in the brain are ones which lead the child, as he or she grows up, to perceive and interpret the world in a very different way than a typically developing child. Let me give you one example of that. One of the things that we know is that there's an area of the brain called the amygdala, which is an area which is involved in the detection of threat. And one of the things that we find is that children who are early in their lives exposed to harsh treatment or to physical or psychosocial neglect, that those children develop a hyperactive amygdala. So their amygdalas are more attuned to threatening stimuli and threatening circumstances in the environment. And so that biases their perception of normal everyday interaction, and it biases their interpretation as well of normal everyday interaction, whether it be with their parents or whether it be with their peers or teachers. And so what you have here is a setting of the brain because of these early experiences early in life that changes brain architecture and changes brain structure. I don't know if that's growing up early, but it certainly does lead to a path of perturbed social and emotional development.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's another question that sort of relates to both of you. I'll ask Dr. Fox first. So as you're looking at Dr. Fox, you would be the one to answer this, but as we're looking at those children, were you seeing any evidence of some of the sensory processing disorders that Dr. Miller was describing?
As a matter of fact, we were. A number of the children, when we first started our study, one of the things that we found is that a good number of the children that were living in conditions of psychosocial neglect were eliciting or exhibiting what's called stereotypies, which are rhythmic movements, rhythmic motor movements. And these stereotypies, I think, are related to the sensory processing deficits that Dr. Miller has talked about. It's interesting to note that, again, in our study, the children that were taken out early and placed into family, that those stereotypies resolved themselves, but they persisted in children who remained in the institution. So the answer is most definite yes.
You would see that. And so, Dr. Miller, do you see that abuse and neglect are a part of sometimes what happens within your center?
We see 4 different causes, we think, for sensory processing issues. One is genetic. Often one of the parents has a problem. The second can be abuse and neglect. The third is difficult birth situations, extreme prematurity, very low birth weight, and things like that. And the fourth has to do with environment, the environments in which they grow up. So we do see children with traumatic stress due to abuse and neglect as one of the types of children that we see in our center.
Very interesting. One more question, I think, for Dr. Fox, maybe for both of you, given that information, Dr. Miller. It's a question from Crocker Stevenson. Given that child maltreatment is directed toward our youngest, what implications does your research, Dr. Fox, have on child welfare policy? It's a big question.
Yeah. So I'm not a policy expert, and I would leave the decisions about policy to those that are. I can really only tell you what the science tells us. And what the science tells us is that leaving children in situations of psychosocial neglect, not only maltreatment, not only physical or sexual abuse, but neglect, that is, not having the appropriate contingent social relationships and social stimulation that their brains expect, leaving children in those situations affects the development of brain architecture in a negative way, and that negative way has lifelong consequences. So what's the implication for policy? Well, one obvious place to go is to think about how long and at what age we want to leave young children in those particular kinds of situations.
Yeah, well, and we certainly know, as the question states, that those kids, those infants and toddlers, are at high risk for child abuse and neglect, of course. We're going to close this up. I promised you all the contact information for each presenter, so here that is for you, I believe, as well as information for my colleagues at 0 to 3 who can help you with story ideas, or to reach out to these experts and others here who can help you on early childhood issues. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so grateful for the ways in which you keep this field in the front of the national conversation. Let us know how we can help. Thanks and happy holidays.